I had never seen my parents this proud, but not because of me. An $8 million deal had just been secured. I fought for it. I built this company from the ground up. But to them, I was still just a placeholder for Jonathan. 8 years ago, I had been the rising star at Morgan Stanley, thriving in the fast-paced world of high finance. Then came the phone call that changed everything. My father's voice heavy with something I'd never heard before. Defeat. The recession had gutted our business. A failed second location had bled us dry. They were 3 months from closing their doors forever. "You're leaving finance to sell fancy jam?" my boss had scoffed when I resigned. Even Jonathan had been incredulous. "It's a sinking ship, Maddie," he'd said, using the nickname I hated. Find them something else to do and move on, but I couldn't move on. This wasn't just about preserving a shop. It was about preserving a legacy. The first 2 years were brutal. Day shifts at the counter, nights buried in spreadsheets. I sold our second location, renegotiated supplier contracts, modernized our financial systems. When money ran tight, I took out a second mortgage, then slept in the stockroom for 6 months to cut costs. And Jonathan? He graduated, took a consulting job, and never looked back. Occasionally, he'd call with generic advice, but he was too busy chasing his own ambitions to care about the family business. Yet somehow, my parents never seemed to mind. "He's gaining valuable experience," they'd say. "It'll benefit Hayes Fine Foods someday." Meanwhile, I was the one transforming it. A single viral blog post had changed everything, putting our preserves on the map. I capitalized on the momentum, launching a subscription box service that skyrocketed to 20,000 monthly subscribers. Strategic partnerships followed. 3 major grocery chains signed on. Revenue surged by 340%. Yet somehow, in my mother's eyes, I was still temporary, a stand-in, a placeholder for Jonathan's eventual return. I drained the last sip of my champagne, setting the glass down carefully. Across the table, Wentworth studied me, his shrewd gaze flicking between me and my mother. He'd caught the subtext in her words. The investors hadn't poured $8 million into the Hayes name. They had poured it into me. As dinner wound down, Wentworth's handshake lingered an extra beat. "We should talk, first thing Monday. Just you." I nodded, understanding him perfectly. My parents, caught up in their excitement over Jonathan's return, had no idea what they had just set in motion. I stared out the car window at the glittering city lights, the fire inside me burning brighter than ever. Monday was going to be very, very interesting. The business had flourished under my leadership, but you'd never know it listening to my parents. When a viral post from a food blogger catapulted our handcrafted preserves into the spotlight, I seized the momentum, launching a subscription box service that skyrocketed to 20,000 monthly subscribers. Last year, I secured partnerships with 3 major gourmet grocery chains, propelling our revenue up 340%. And yet, despite the numbers, despite the growth, their gratitude always carried an unspoken "this is temporary," a quiet certainty that no matter what I built, Jonathan would inherit it. "Victoria," Wentworth's voice pulled me back to the present. I blinked, the hum of conversation fading as I registered the expectant looks around the table. "Apologies," I said, schooling my features. "Could you repeat that?" "I was asking about the company's leadership moving forward," Wentworth said, his gaze sharp. "Your operational strategy is solid, but we need clarity on management." The words landed like a cue, and beside me my mother stiffened, as if bracing for the moment she'd been waiting for. "The leadership structure will remain as it is," I said evenly, ignoring the heat of her stare. "I'll continue as CEO. My parents will serve as brand ambassadors and advisors to maintain the authentic family identity that resonates with our customers." Wentworth nodded, jotting something in his notebook. "And your brother?" His tone was neutral, but I could already feel the shift in the room. Before I could answer, my mother pounced. "Jonathan just completed his executive MBA at Wharton," she announced, her voice warm with the same pride that had always been noticeably absent when discussing my accomplishments. "He'll be joining the leadership team next month. His consulting experience will be invaluable as we scale." I didn't so much as flinch. I'd played this game before, but the sting was there, sharp and familiar. Jonathan had spent exactly 3 weekends in the shop over the past 8 years, and yet here she was, acting as though he had built it from the ground up. Wentworth's gaze flicked between us, reading the tension with the practiced ease of an investor accustomed to power struggles. "I see," he said. "And what will his role be?" "We haven't finalized that yet," I said quickly, trying to get ahead of whatever my mother was about to say. "Right now, our focus is on closing this investment round." But she wasn't done. "Jonathan has always had the strongest business mind in the family," she continued, the words light and offhand, but cutting in their implication. "Victoria has done wonderfully with the creative aspects, but Jonathan understands the financial side in a way that will be crucial for expansion." I nearly laughed, actually laughed. I had been a financial analyst before taking over the company. I'd restructured our operations, saved us from bankruptcy, and just secured an $8 million investment. And yet, Jonathan, who hadn't so much as glanced at a balance sheet since undergrad, was suddenly the financial mastermind. Across the table, Wentworth exchanged a glance with Amelia Vaughn, another key investor. It was subtle, but I recognized the shift instantly. The quiet recalibration that happened when investors reevaluated risk. "Mrs. Hayes," Wentworth said carefully, "our investment is largely based on Victoria's track record and vision. We need to discuss any significant leadership changes before finalizing the agreement." The words hit like a slap, and for the first time my mother faltered. She hadn't expected pushback, hadn't considered that the investors weren't backing the family name. They were backing me. My father cleared his throat awkwardly. Of course," he said, eager to smooth over the tension. "Victoria has built something remarkable, and we're just proud parents excited to have both our children involved. Nothing set in stone." But it was already too late. The conversation drifted into safer territory, but the damage had been done. As dinner wound down, I caught Wentworth speaking quietly with his team, their expressions serious. When we said our goodbyes, his handshake was firmer than usual. "We should talk, first thing Monday, just you." I nodded, the message crystal clear. My parents, oblivious to the shift, rode home in the town car chatting about Jonathan's return, completely missing what had just happened. I stared out at the Boston skyline, the city lights streaking past as my mind raced. I barely slept. By 6 a.m. Saturday, I was back at my desk, the dim morning light filtering through the office windows as I spread out 8 years' worth of work. Spreadsheets, market analyses, growth projections, all evidence of the empire I had built. The cleaning crew passed by, surprised but not shocked. They'd seen this before. "Ms. Hayes, everything okay?" Antonio, our longtime head of maintenance, stood at the door, arms crossed. I didn't look up from my laptop, just preparing for a big meeting. "Another one?" He raised a brow. "After that fancy dinner last night? You worked too hard, you know." I smiled, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. "This one's important, Antonio. Maybe the most important meeting I've ever had." When he left, I finally made the call I'd been holding off on for months, out of loyalty, out of some misplaced sense of family obligation. "Victoria," came Eleanor's groggy voice. "It's 6:30 on a Saturday." "I need your advice," I said without preamble, "and possibly your help." 45 minutes later, she walked through my office door with 2 coffees and a sharp, assessing look. I didn't waste time. I laid everything out. The dinner, my mother's not-so-subtle plan to hand Jonathan the keys to my kingdom, the investor's reaction. When I finished, Eleanor sat back, fingers tapping against her cup. "You've known this moment was coming for years," she said simply. "What do you really want?" The question hung heavy between us. Recognition? A seat at the table I had already built? Or something more? I took a slow breath. "I want what I've earned," Eleanor nodded, as if I had just confirmed what she already knew. "Then let's make some calls." By noon, the strategy was in motion. I had secured an emergency meeting with Wentworth's investment team for Sunday morning. I reached out to my people, the ones who had been in the trenches with me. Audrey from marketing, Benjamin from operations, Rachel from product development. They didn't hesitate. They showed up. Meanwhile, my parents called twice, eager to discuss Jonathan's grand ideas for the business. I let their calls go to voicemail. This weekend wasn't about Jonathan. It wasn't about them. It was about me. By Sunday morning, I was running on 2 hours of sleep and an unstoppable resolve. When Wentworth and his team arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, their expressions were a mix of curiosity and concern. "Victoria," Wentworth began, as we settled into the conference room, "I've been in this business long enough to trust my instincts. Something about that dinner didn't sit right with me." "You're right to be concerned." I slid folders across the table. Page 1 is the current leadership structure of Hayes Fine Foods. Page 2 is what it will look like if my parents have their way after the deal closes. Wentworth flipped the page, his brow furrowing. Jonathan as CEO. Me, relegated to a vague creative role, stripped of decision-making power. "This wasn't what we negotiated," he said. "No," I agreed, "it wasn't. But it's been the unspoken plan since I joined the company. No matter what I build, Jonathan is still the presumed heir." Amelia Vaughn, another lead investor, turned to the third page. "And this?" I met her gaze. "That's my counter-proposal." The room went silent. I let them absorb what I was offering. A new entity, independent of my parents, of Jonathan, of the legacy that had tried to confine me. "You want to redirect our investment into a separate company," Wentworth said, studying me. "Yes," I said, clicking through my overnight prepared presentation. "Let me show you why that makes financial sense." I laid out the numbers, the explosive growth, the brand loyalty, the community engagement that I had personally built. Customer surveys showed that people weren't buying because of the Hayes name. They were buying because of the story I had crafted, the innovations I had introduced. "And what about the manufacturing relationships?" Vaughn asked. "Wouldn't you be starting from scratch?" I shook my head. Our 3 primary partners have upcoming contract renewals. I maintain those relationships personally. They know who really runs this business. The more I spoke, the clearer it became. The investors weren't just interested. They were sold. Wentworth leaned back, tapping his pen against the table. "This is impressive work for one weekend," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "But I get the feeling you've been planning this much longer." I smiled, because he was right. I had been waiting for this moment for years, and now, finally, I was taking it. I nodded, the weight of the moment settling over me. "I've had this contingency plan for 3 years," I admitted. "I've watched how my parents treat Jonathan versus how they treat me. I knew this day might come." Wentworth studied me for a long moment, then exchanged glances with his team. "We invested in you, Victoria, not just the company. The Hayes brand has value, but you're the visionary who made it what it is." He leaned back in his chair, considering. "We need to conduct due diligence on this new approach, but I'm inclined to redirect our investment as you've proposed, with some modifications to protect all parties." Relief flooded through me. Thank you. I was prepared to walk away with nothing if necessary. That wouldn't serve anyone's interests, Wentworth replied smoothly, least of all ours. But there's one condition. You need to have an honest conversation with your parents before we finalize anything. Give them a chance to recognize what they're about to lose. I wanted to refuse, to spare myself the inevitable disappointment, but I knew he was right. I'll speak with them tonight. When the investors left, I called a meeting with my core team, the people who had been in the trenches with me for years. I hadn't told them about my contingency plan before, unsure if they would see it as a betrayal of the family business. I always wondered if you had an exit strategy, Audrey mused once I laid out the situation. The way your parents talk about Jonathan, it was only a matter of time. Benjamin nodded. We've worked with you for years, Victoria, not the Hayes name. Are you saying you'd come with me? I asked, taken aback by their immediate support. In a heartbeat, Rachel said without hesitation. We've already talked about it. We saw this coming, especially with Jonathan finishing his MBA. Their unwavering loyalty hit me harder than I expected. They weren't just employees. They were the ones who saw my worth when my own family never had. That evening, I drove to my parents' house with a strange sense of calm. For years, I had been fighting for recognition, proving my worth through sheer results. But now I understood. No amount of success would ever change how they saw me. Jonathan would always be their heir, no matter how little he had contributed, no matter how much I had built. As I pulled into their driveway, my phone rang. Jonathan. Hey, Maddie. His voice was bright, easy. Just landed. Mom said something about a big investment. Sounds like my timing couldn't be better. I smiled to myself. Perfect timing, I said. I'll see you tomorrow at the office. Tomorrow, Monday, the day everything would change. The conversation with my parents went exactly as I expected. My mother looked stricken. Victoria, how could you even consider abandoning the family legacy? My father, ever the peacemaker, tried for middle ground. Maybe you and Jonathan can co-lead the company. There's room for both of you. I met his gaze evenly. I've run this business alone for 8 years. Why would I need a co-leader now just as we're about to expand? Jonathan brings fresh perspectives, my mother insisted. He's always had the strongest business mind in the family. I almost laughed. Based on what? I asked, my voice calm but cutting. His consulting job that he quit after 2 years, his MBA that I paid for while I was reinvesting my salary into saving this company? My father looked pained. Victoria, please understand. This was always the plan. Jonathan is the firstborn. I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice level. I'm 37 years old. I increased company revenue by 3,000%. I secured an $8 million investment based on my leadership and execution. And none of that matters? Because Jonathan was born first? Because he's your son and I'm not? The silence that followed was deafening. They had no defense, no logic, no argument, just tradition and preference. I stood, smoothing my blazer. The investors are backing me, not the family name. You have until tomorrow morning to decide if you want to recognize that reality or lose everything I built. I walked out, leaving them stunned. As I reached the door, my eyes landed on an old family portrait above the fireplace. Jonathan, front and center. Me, slightly off to the side. It had always been that way. I just hadn't wanted to see it. Monday morning arrived, bright and clear. I arrived at the office at 7:30 a.m., needing the quiet before the storm. I'd chosen this time deliberately. My parents would arrive at 8:30, Jonathan at 8:45 for his grand debut, and the investors at precisely 9. It gave me just enough space to steady myself for what was coming. But as I walked in, I wasn't alone. Audrey, Benjamin, Rachel, and a dozen other key employees were already there, waiting. "What are you all doing here?" I asked, glancing around at their determined faces. Audrey smiled. "We wanted you to know you're not alone in this. Whatever happens today, we're with you." The simple gesture nearly broke me, but I swallowed the emotion and nodded. "Thank you." I turned toward my office, needing just a few more minutes to finalize my approach. At exactly 8:30, my parents walked in, my mother dressed as if preparing for a major corporate presentation, my father looking drained from the argument we'd had the night before. At 8:42, Jonathan strolled in, exuding the effortless entitlement of someone who had never once had to fight for his place. His tailored suit was impeccable, his handshake firm as he greeted employees he barely knew, already playing the role of CEO without having earned a single second of it. My mother beamed as she ushered him around the office like a visiting dignitary, pointing out operations he had never contributed to, never sacrificed for. I stood behind the glass walls of my office and watched, silent but ready. Then, at 9 o'clock sharp, the elevator doors slid open. Wentworth stepped in, flanked by his investment team and 2 lawyers from Langley Investments. The air in the office shifted immediately. Employees straightened. Conversations hushed. My mother was the first to act, practically gliding toward Wentworth with an outstretched hand. "Mr. Wentworth, we're so delighted to have you here. I'd love for you to meet my son, Jonathan. He's just returned from—" "Actually, Mrs. Hayes," Wentworth interrupted, polite but firm, "we're here to speak with Victoria, though I think it would be beneficial for all of you to join us in the conference room." And just like that, the reckoning began. Inside the conference room, the tension was suffocating. My parents and Jonathan sat on one side, the investment team on the other, with me at the head of the table. Years of unspoken family politics collided with unflinching business reality. Wentworth unclasped his briefcase and laid out a set of documents. "Before we begin, I want to be clear about something. Langley Investments approved our investment based on Victoria's leadership, vision, and execution. Our due diligence was centered on her ability to scale this company, not on family legacy." Jonathan shifted in his seat, the easy confidence from earlier flickering. My mother's smile froze, brittle at the edges. "Since our discussion on Friday," Wentworth continued, "we've had to reevaluate our position. It's clear there are differing expectations regarding leadership." My father cleared his throat. "We've always envisioned Hayes Fine Foods as a family-run business, with both our children contributing their unique strengths." "With all due respect, Mr. Hayes," Amelia Vaughn interjected, "our investment was predicated on continuity of leadership. Victoria took this company from near bankruptcy to a national player. Any significant leadership change represents a material risk to our agreement." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice smooth, confident, like he was pitching a case study instead of defending a title he'd never earned. "I understand your concerns," he said, "but my executive MBA and consulting experience position me well to—" "To what?" Wentworth cut in, blunt and unimpressed. "To replace the person who saved this company, who grew it by 3,000%, who secured this investment." Silence. My mother's complexion paled. My father's jaw tightened. Jonathan, for once in his life, had nothing to say. Wentworth slid a folder across the table. "We have a proposition. 2 options, actually. I suggest you review them carefully." With hesitant hands, my parents opened the folder. Inside were 2 legal documents. The first, the original investment agreement, now revised to ensure I remained CEO for at least 5 years, while Jonathan would hold a non-executive position with no decision-making power. The second, a $10 million investment proposal for a new company, one that I would own outright, independent of the Hayes family name. My father's voice was barely above a whisper. "What is this?" I folded my hands on the table. "Insurance, in case you still don't understand what's actually valuable here." Jonathan grabbed the second document, scanning the contents. His face reddened. "You're threatening to start a competing business? Against your own family?" I met his gaze, calm and unflinching. "No, Jonathan. I'm protecting the value I created, the value you had no part in building. Where were you when I was sleeping on a cot in the stockroom to make payroll? When I was personally delivering orders because we couldn't afford shipping fees? When I was redesigning our entire product line while working the register?" My voice was steady, but the weight of 8 years of sacrifice sat behind every word. My mother's face paled, her carefully composed demeanor cracking. "Victoria, you can't possibly mean to abandon your family's legacy." Before I could respond, the conference room door opened. Audrey walked in, followed by Benjamin, Rachel, and over a dozen other employees, people who had fought beside me, built this company with me, and knew exactly who had carried it on their back. Audrey's voice was firm, carrying the quiet power of collective resolve. "Excuse the interruption, but we wanted to make something clear. If Victoria leaves to start a new company, we go with her, all of us." The reaction was instant. Whispers erupted around the room. My father stiffened. My mother's hands clenched into fists on the table, and Jonathan's confident mask slipped into something dangerously close to panic. They had always assumed that control over the business meant control over its people, but what they were now realizing, too late, was that loyalty belonged not to the Hayes name, but to the one who had actually led. I let the silence stretch, watching the reality sink in. Then, with measured calm, I said, "The choice is yours. Recognize what I've built and who built it, or watch me walk away with everything that makes this company valuable." For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sounds in the room were the shuffling of papers and the quiet murmur of investors conferring. Wentworth and his team remained impassive, waiting. My employees stood at the edges of the room, a living reminder of where the true foundation of the company lay. Finally, my father exhaled heavily, his shoulders slumping as he pushed the first document forward. "We'll sign this one," he said, resignation thick in his voice. "Victoria stays as CEO." My mother's expression was tight, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, but she nodded. Jonathan, however, looked as if the ground had just been ripped from beneath him. "A wise decision," Wentworth said simply, motioning to his legal team to finalize the paperwork. 2 hours later, it was done. The investment was locked in, but with new ironclad protections ensuring my leadership. Jonathan was given a position, Vice President of Business Development, but with strict boundaries, reporting under me, and no decision-making authority. My parents were officially stepping back, their roles reduced to brand ambassadors, stripped of any operational influence. That was 6 months ago. Today, Hayes Fine Foods is thriving. Our expansion is ahead of schedule. Our new product lines are exceeding projections by 40%, and to the outside world, we look like the picture-perfect story of family entrepreneurship. But behind the polished press releases, the reality is far more complicated. My relationship with my parents and Jonathan is strictly professional, cordial, but devoid of the warmth it once held. I attend family dinners out of obligation, but I no longer look for approval in their eyes. Some wounds don't heal. They simply become part of who you are. But the betrayal taught me something invaluable. My worth isn't measured by whether my family acknowledges it. My real family is the one that stood behind me that Monday morning, ready to risk everything because they believed in me. I may carry the Hayes name on my business cards, but the legacy I've built, that is mine alone.